All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the collapse of communism in China. So not quite the same thing as the end of the Cold War, but it's the end of the Cold War in the sense of there is no big communist enemy to fight. So, in 1976, Mao Zedong dies. And the person who becomes paramount leader after him is a man named Deng Xiaoping. And he wants to increase stability and growth. He basically recognizes that maybe Mao, towards the end of his life, had a few bad ideas, like the Great Leap Forward and 55 million people dying, or like the Cultural Revolution and like destroying China's culture. And so he wants to fix those things, and kind of provide the Chinese people with the opportunity to experience a truly better life, not just one kind of lit by the fires of revolutionary fervor. So he decides he's going to allow more influence. He frees almost 100,000 political prisoners. And he also allows for a critical evaluation of Mao and his policies, and expresses publicly that there were definitely mistakes made. Mao continues to be praised as a revolutionary hero, but that maybe there were some excesses that got them away from where they needed to be. He institutes multiple economic reforms. He starts by dismantling collective farms and allowing for small-scale private agriculture. He also eagerly is embraced by the peasants. Both his leadership style and also his reforms are. They jump at the opportunity to run their own farms. And they start running all of these things like their private businesses. And this continues over to managers of state companies, so state enterprises and corporations. These managers are given greater authority. They're encouraged to make decisions like they were private owners, and seek a profit. And he also starts to welcome foreign investment into China. And because of that, we see stunning economic growth and a massive increase in prosperity. So if we look, for example, at their GDP between 1952 and 2005, here in 1976, this is Mao dying, right? It says the Cultural Revolution. You can see that there's not a lot of economic growth here. Then after he institutes farm privatization, you can see it starts to increase. And then after 1992, right, this increase becomes pretty tremendous. And it's continued to be tremendous. So until recently, obviously, but China has had over 10% GDP growth per year. And they are the second largest economy in the world, which is really spectacular that they were able to go from something so small to something so big, through the reforms that Deng Xiaoping really institutes. It's not all great, right? So it's not all like shiny Shanghai with its massive skyscrapers and shiny stores and nightclubs. There's a huge increase in corruption because of the close ties between business and the government. The current Chinese paramount leader, Xi Jinping, he is trying to really root out some of that corruption, but it's kind of the nature of the beast when you have business and government tied so closely, when they're like essentially the same thing in China. Right, it's going to be very difficult to avoid corruption. Massive environmental damage. Right, the air pollution in China is so horrible. That's why until recently, right, they wear masks all the time. It's not so much even for germs. It's to clean the air before they breathe it in, because the pollution is so horrific. The cities are overcrowded, and there's been an increase in inequality. They typically equate, and Deng Xiaoping does this as well, they equate democracy with anarchy, and they've brutally crushed protests. So if you watch the crash course on China, like current contemporary China, it essentially like points out the fact that you could not watch that crash course video in China, because that's how bad the censorship is. And I should have included the famous photo in this slideshow, but when a large group of students and youth start to protest and ask for more democracy, they go to right outside the Forbidden City in a place called Tiananmen Square. And they're protesting there for several days, and they send the army in on them. So that's how they deal with these protests. They find them unacceptable. They're not going to tolerate it, right? And you can't. That's hidden from the Chinese people. So like you cannot find a book in China on the Tiananmen Square massacre. You cannot Google search it. I mean, they don't even have Google, right? You can't find it, right? Because of the Great Firewall of China. So what they've done is essentially created what we call state capitalism, where it is a statist system, as in the state, right? State capitalism. Or authoritarian capitalism. So whereas we think of capitalism being kind of tied to democracy, this idea of a free market and a free people, China has a free market and not free people. So that's been kind of boggling to a lot of like theorists in the last few years, because in the last few decades really, because how do you mix the two, right? Like, how do you have increasing prosperity without people starting to question, I don't want to say the nature of their reality, but the nature of the world? Kind of in the historical development of capitalism and democracy, they went hand in hand. So what is going on here? What are the larger ramifications of a free market without a free people? Will those unfree people eventually require freedom? Or can it continue on? Is it the kind of new system? It's hard to say.